Okay, you guys just write down start writing down the names and yeah. Key names, motion, please. Can somebody please read out the full motion?
This House would prioritize food security over export crops.
Yeah, examples to actually.
Rice, wheat.
On which one?
That's it.
Rice and wheat is
Food security is rice, wheat, corn, and all that. The export crops is things like rubber, palm oil.
Alright guys, welcome to the pre-quarters of Malaysian National 2014. Congratulations to all teams for making it to this round. On OG, we have KUA. On CG, UMB. On OO, Curtin C. And COU, B. On motion, this House will prioritize food security, i.e. rice, wheat, corn, over export crops, palm oil, and rubber. Without further ado, before that, as a reminder, please switch off all your phones or put them on silent mode. If you want to please walk in between the speakers, and yeah, that's all. Now, without further ado, can we welcome Prime Minister?
Here.
We have a problem when the poor can't sufficiently buy goods that they need to sustain their lives, right? This is proven when we see there's subsidies given to things like rice, where people need to because it's expensive, right? That's something that we are trying to solve in this debate today. We think the prioritization of these goods would help the poor, and I'll prove it to you throughout my speech. But firstly, what's our mechanism now? Now we'll shift a certain amount of funds that we pump in for the development or the production of export crops into the development and research, or either incentivizing people to opt into the agricultural field, right? This is how we incentivize people to increase the production of food security, the food that we currently have, and increase the strength of food security. And this debate revolves around, we are talking about developing nations because we think the poor here needs help, given that even subsidies are not sufficient. But first, let's move on. Let's move on to my first point on how this form of prioritization of goods helps the poor, right? Because we think when there's increasing supply for these goods, there'll be a price reduction towards these goods and how poor people can access it. Because currently in status quo now, most of these goods are mainly over-succumbed by these rich people, where the poor people lose out in terms of competition, and they don't really have that access towards that food. And we think that's something that's really harmful to those people. We think that's something that governments have to step in to help these poor, to help them elevate in terms of how they can actually access things that are necessities to them, and things that they can help them to improve their living status. But before I move on further,
clarification, sir. We understand that you want to shift and prioritize, but could you give us specific examples of how these forms of prioritization will take place, or specific examples of policies that you'd like to introduce to shape this prioritization?
Sir, I just said like we'll shift the funding from the export crops into the field of agriculture, right? I think that's really simple. That we don't know why opposition don't understand that, right? I'll move on to talking about how like the government has a duty in terms of succumbing towards the people's need instead of economic security, right? Because I think the state facilitates on how the economy actually works, right? And I think when basic goods are now cheaper and poor people have access towards have better access towards these food, now poor people have more of a chance in terms of productivity where they can contribute to society, right? Because we think when people aren't really able to get food easily, we think it's something that distracts them in terms of providing their services towards society or positively contributing into the society in terms of working or in terms of surviving alone. Sit down. I think that's something that's also harmful when we don't really have enough food and we have over dependence in other countries in terms of import. We need imported goods in our country. We understand that to a certain extent we really need imported food, right? But we think that dependence that we currently have on these imported goods, imported food, is something that's harmful, and because these countries can always manipulate these prices, and we are on a losing end, right? Because that's something that we can't escape. Food is something that people need, and in cases that we are insufficient, we'll always have to rely on an external source in terms of how we can garner, or how in terms of we can get this food at the end of the day, right? We think it's something that the government should always maintain as priority, other than export crops, where we don't think that we think that even when they have benefits to society, benefits to the country's economy, we think people's needs, something that's direly in need, is something that we should prioritize, right? Sit down. We think that when we are overly dependent on other countries, now in terms of economy, we don't really stand out in terms of international trade, right? Because we rely too much on them in terms of getting these goods, and how these goods can be easily manipulated. Side opposition may come and say, oh, sure, we can trade them for export crops, right? But we don't think that's necessarily sufficient, because in terms of how we already told you, these goods are a necessity in comparison to how these export crops are just things that are possible entities that can boost the economy. We think that there's a certain prioritization that has to take place, right? But before I move on, sure.
What do you plan on doing with these farms that already exist for food security once the food security problem no longer exists within status quo?
It's really simple, right? That he didn't understand where it's already, like, these food farms already exist. We acknowledge the existence of these food farms, right? But we think even with those food farms, we still encounter a deficiency in terms of food supply. That's the problem we're trying to curb, right? Because understand, to a certain extent, rich people can always access imported goods, can always take imported goods, but they also have that choice to opt for local goods or opt for goods that are produced by the country, right? And that's when it comes in, when poor people don't have a choice. They will always have to opt for the cheaper goods, which in status quo we don't really have, right? Because of that subsidy that we have on rice and other goods, that people actually are reliant on the government to help them survive, right? That's something that we have to acknowledge, and that's like opposition have to tell us why it's still better to prioritize export crops and get money that don't actually relate into the helping the poor, right? That's how I'll bring into my second substantive on how we talk about exports goods and how the prices of these export goods are easily manipulated, and at the end of the day, the revenues from these export goods don't really relate into helping the poor, and how this is a form of economical injustice towards these poor people. Because we think to a certain extent there's still a state priority when it comes to helping the poor and providing welfare and things like that, right? But we think it's insufficient in terms, right, where we don't give them sufficient buying power, we don't give them enough avenues to opt for when it comes to food. We think our policy caters for those insufficiencies or that deficiencies that already exist in status quo. our policy would incentivize more farmers to come out to expand their plantations in a way, or we incentivize people who don't really work and want and get those incentives now to start exploiting the agriculture field, because we think that's something that side opposition might talk about in terms of how job employment exists more under the SIRE. We don't think that's mutually. We think we don't think it's really sufficient for them. We don't think it's something that's exclusive, and we think it's better that it also is similar, that we can facilitate that job employment in terms of incentivizing and providing fundings into this agriculture field, where we can better improve the supply we currently have, or better improve the in terms of production or manufacturing of these goods. Right? We think our policy helps the poor, and the poor are in need.
Thank you. We have,
Madam Chair, in any debate where you want to shift the priority and you want to shift the focus into prioritizing something else, you need to come and tell us not only why you want to do it, and you also need to go into details as to how you're going to do it and whether or not it's going to be particularly effective. The only thing we've heard from side opening government is as to why they need to do it. They didn't specifically tell us how they're going to do it. They didn't specifically tell us how effective it's going to be. They needed to get into details as to, because when I POI'd them to give me a particular policy or example of how they're going to do it, the only response that we got from them was, look, we're going to shift money and try to invest. Shifting money alone doesn't solve the problem. Tell me, where are you going to then allocate those funds in terms of solving the food security problems, and tell me whether those solutions are going to work. Neither of which we heard from side opening government mechanism definitely never stands. Because I am going to analyze for you the problems that you have with food security, and from side opening opposition, we're going to actually prove to you why prioritizing exports is actually going to help solve food security issues on a long-term scale. Listen to this. The one thing that we need to understand about food security is that it's not a problem that can be solved within 1 day or within 2 days. There needs to be a certain degree of prioritization, a certain degree of long-term visibility, long-term vision here. That is precisely where we're coming from, side opening opposition. Problems with food security. It's not just a matter of not being able to access food, because the point that came out from side opening opposition was, number one, we think that poor people need food. Poor people need, access to food, need to be able to purchase the food. You need to tell me what's the problem, why don't they get the food? Let me then analyze to you what's the issues with food security. Problem number one in countries like India is distribution. These people in poor regions don't only get food, they don't get food not because of the lack of, food or anything. They don't get food primarily because of problems with regards to distribution. It's becoming harder and harder to access rural areas, to access rural villages in order to be able to distribute this food accordingly. Second problem is fluctuation in demand. There are various seasons in this form of countries, meaning that at certain points in time, certain local crops will have a certain higher degree of demand. But at certain point in time, the demand ceases to exist. And what happens when the demand doesn't exist, if you continuously prioritize these forms of local crops, what happens is you have an over excess of food. When you have an over excess of food, either you have to find an expensive way to keep it and stockpile it, or secondly, you have to figure out a way in which you're going to reduce these prices and then sell, which is obviously going to be negative profit to a certain extent. So we don't understand the point in that particular situation as well. Third problem we think when it comes to food security is the lack of incentive for farmers, considering that in status quo, there is a severe lack in terms of how we subsidize the people. Yes, certain degrees of subsidies exist, but not too much, especially in countries like India, where there's a severe lack in terms of access, there's a severe lack of problems in terms of how you distribute this food equally. There needs to be a higher incentive, and we'll prove to you how our proposal will go ahead with it. Why do we think exports are important? Number one, these exports are generally sects of economy that generally generate insane amount of revenue for every nation, particularly for countries like India, particularly for countries like Malaysia for that matter, whereby our export product like petroleum, for instance, generates this massive amount of revenue. But secondly, these export crops are usually easier to grow and much easier to stockpile, for instances, right? So for countries like India, whenever they prioritize export products, even if there is an excess, they're able to still sell it much more effectively. They're able to stockpile it much more effectively. Number three, we think that we need to continue prioritizing this because there are existing infrastructures that allow us to continue develop and export more and more product. Then we need to get into the more interesting part. How will this particular prioritization of exports then benefit in terms of solving food security problem? We need to acknowledge that the food security problem is not something that can be solved by a stopgap measure, right? You can't just shift a radical policy and just say, okay, from now onwards, we're going to prioritize local crops. And you can't just immediately solve the problem considering the various spectrums within which the problem lies. Number one, first thing you can do is that these revenues will then help fund purchasing of staple food from other countries, for instances. Like countries like Malaysia, for instances, can sell their petroleum at expensive prices, make incredible amount of revenue, and can then use those revenue to then purchase cheaper rice from Indonesia, for example, whereby we can maximize the amount of local staple foods that we're able to then distribute to the public. But secondly, when it comes to food security, one of the major lack of situation in terms of how you want to solve it is research and development. If you're able to then prioritize more in terms of food export, more in terms of exports and generating revenue, this revenue can then be channeled towards R&D efforts to then solve food security problems in various issues. And what particular aspect of food security problems we are talking here? We're talking about conduciveness in terms of the local demand. We're talking about conduciveness in terms of the soil and the environment within which this food crops are grown. There needs to be various research and various development in terms of understanding what are the problems that exist in terms of solving this particular situation. And we think that if we are able to use this form of revenue to channel into research and development, we're able to solve that problem. But thirdly, we also think that when you continuously prioritize export, you're able to boost your economy to then invite more, a higher degree of foreign direct investment to improvise the local agricultural scene, right? We think that the local agricultural scene in terms of technology, in terms of accessibility will be far more improvised when you have investors from foreign countries coming in. And investors will only be attracted to come into your country if there is a certain degree of stability when it comes to your country's economy. And we think that that can only happen under our paradigm. But thirdly, we think that fourthly, we also think that this revenue will be able to increase the sort of farming subsidies that we can have. We can use the subsidies to then incentivize farmers to be far more active in terms of the local crops that they grow and in terms of the amount of local crops that they grow as well. And this will then help in terms of the quantity and solve the problem in terms of quantity. But then how do you also tackle the problems in terms of distribution? Distribution problem lies in two. Number one, technology in terms of accessing these areas. Number two, in terms of transportation, how do you then penetrate this region? In terms of accessibility, we can use this revenue to then continue research and development in terms of increasing the technology to access these areas. But we also think that number two, we can then further incentivize things like the concept of middlemen. We can incentivize things like hypermarkets to be able to open in those areas to then be able to attract all these people and solve the problems in terms of accessibility. The one major point, the one major understanding of this entire scenario needs to happen is that we need to understand that the concept of food security is not something that can be solved overnight. A stopgap measure just won't cut it. We need to look at the bigger picture, and investment and generating revenue out of export crops is definitely the way to go forward. If you were to shift your priority towards a stopgap measure like immediately prioritizing local crops, if it doesn't work out in the near future, then it only screws the situation even more. And we think that from our side, we have proved to you on so many different levels as to why it's far more important to prioritize exports. For all those reasons, we encourage the crowd to propose.
Thank you. Now I can welcome the DPM.
Thank you.
When countries like India, Malaysia, and all these developing countries has a capacity to grow and the right kind of soil and season to grow good crops that is beneficial for the country, and yet they still are so heavily reliant on neighboring countries in order to import goods and for the government to heavily subsidize the goods. We don't find that it is beneficial for the government to continue in the status quo. Something has to be done, and this is why we propose. In the first place, right, when we talk about how we shift prioritization to food security, here's how. What opening opposition talked about, all the measures can be applied in how we build allow this policy to take place. Right? First of all, if you want to fund research and development, we find that the amount of revenue in status quo that we get, we channel those revenue in order to fund good research and development for good seeds that grows better, right? That has better quality of rice and is beneficial. We encourage more lands to be developed for food security instead of crops that instead of export crops. We allow tax breaks for companies that prioritize food securities and is in line with this policy. And the entire and the idea that the current when they are over when the food security problem is solved and how the land will be used, we find that there is no problem for you to reconvert to export crops if when that problem is solved. Right? So we don't see how there is a problem in terms of how they what closing opposition POI. So on how it is effective in a way that we incentivize for companies to cater to the most basic needs of the people first. Even if you talk about how export crops brings in so much revenue, that it builds your GDP, right? But GDP only looks good on paper. But however, it does not help the poverty line at all. When the poorest section of the society isn't helped, we don't think the kind of trickle-down economy that they're talking about would benefit the poor in the long run. First of all, when you talk about the problems of food security, how it cannot be solved in the short run, we find our policy is one that is beneficial in the long run. When you need a clear form of action that push towards the prioritization of food security, on how we make sure that the country takes active measures in order to provide all these crops for the people in the first place. We don't want to be dependent or buy cash crops using all your revenues. Right? Because first of all, you have to remember that in times of food shortage, right, where emergencies happen, do you think other countries will be willing to give you your crops? Where terms of exports will be determined by those countries. We don't find that is beneficial. Where in Malaysia's case, right, we depend on Thailand for rice exports. When there are food shortages, when there are political troubles, that is extremely dangerous for Malaysia when you depend so heavily on places like Thailand. On the entire idea on how there's a problem in India on how distribution is the problem. When the supply is a lot more and it becomes a lot cheaper because of the economies of scale that you gain, we find that even if there is a problem of distribution, it becomes far cheaper for you to bring this food to the rural areas, right? These people can still buy these crops in less expensive thing. So if you want to talk about how there's a problem of overstockpiling, we find that we can equally export all these goods to other countries as well. So you don't find that as a problem. So onto my first option, different. Okay.
What happens when the level of food security now becomes comfortable under your paradigm?
When it's comfortable, okay lah. Then the problem is solved. Then we allow for you to focus on other things. We don't find how that is a problem. Right now, it's crucial and dire for us to tackle that problem first. So our country needs to make sure that we have the right research and the right direction we go in the first place, which is what our policy is fighting for. So on the entire on how we need to prioritize, we should not prioritize. We should not prioritize export crops because first, when export crops, the amount of price, how it fluctuates. In history, we study on how previously UK has this support that regulates the price of rubber, right? How does that benefit your economy in the long run? When the price is it can be manipulated and distorted by prices internationally. If you want to depend on that kind of revenue, which is extremely unstable, we find that does not benefit your country in the long run. Which is why we need to take that active measure to push for a good solid ground in order to make sure that your people has food from your own country. Right? It also provides for more jobs for these people, people on the ground who can focus all these agriculture measures. Right? On the entire idea on how the idea of how trickle down economy is good and beneficial, and how in the long run they think that they can help prioritize food and the poor. We don't find that is true, because even if the government tax, or even if the government slowly channels all those funds into these places that are into rice or wheat production, we don't think that it is we don't think that these measures can tackle this problem fast enough or soon enough in order to make sure that these poor people have enough access to all this food.
Why isn't the ceiling price enough to reduce the price of food?
Okay, the problem is with ceiling prices, right? The government has to channel so much subsidies onto all these goods. It is not a real measure to bring down the price of rice or anything else, right? We find that the real way for you to reduce the price of all these staple foods or foods that all these people need, right? It's by increasing the production in your own local arena, where you make sure that there is economies of scale. You reap all these benefits from the extra from a greater amount of production, where cost is lower. When you can produce all these goods in a more efficient manner. We don't want to rely on foreign countries. We don't want to rely and over depend on these countries, especially in times of emergency. But you can simply fluctuate all the prices of food. We think that when the export revenue that comes from rubber or oil palm is extremely detrimental. It's extremely bad for the country to be so dependent on all these revenues, and for you to slowly channel all these funds into prioritizing rice or wheat. Right? That kind of measure is too slow, and it might not succeed in the long run. But once we guarantee a clear outcome here, we guarantee that there's something that we are changing, and that the poor people can actually get food that they need. With this, we are proud of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Madam Speaker, the major question I need to ask the entire bench is, why kill the cash cow to feed the suckling pig? We have existing infrastructure that will be able to sustain development and sustain revenue, so we can allow for stopgap measures to be able to fill any voids that exist. That is the best policy to go with, especially when the situation, if they're painting it as it is critical enough for it to hit the fan. The stopgap measures allow for a consistency in the market for access. But the problem lies here. They say poor people can't have access to it. Well, my previous speaker has already told you that, number one, there are things like distribution. There are things like the fact that transportation of these goods and stuff like that is essentially problematic because of it being in rural areas. Not only that, the fact is a lot of these goods are perishable, and the fact that they're also susceptible to things like pestilences. But guess what? So I haven't accepted you. Sit down, please. All right, but those such problems don't necessarily exist because there is an existing infrastructure to negate those problems from happening in exports, which is the best thing to happen. Let me give you a couple of rebuttals. They tell us that India has the best propensity to be able to do this, yet they need to heavily subsidize each other. Well, number one, India had a very unique problem. First of all,
distribution was a problem because of the sheer landmass of that particular nation. But not only that, you had insidious middlemen that were essentially stockpiling grains and crops and redistributing them and heightened prices once the access was limited. So yes, you have insidious middlemen to be able to profit from that.
So,
but here's the thing, they painted the picture that poor people don't have access to it. But guess what? Apart from the fact that distribution and stockpiling is an issue, what if they don't have the median income to be able to purchase goods at the reasonably subsidized rates? Therefore, if they're poor, they still can't be able to access it anyway until their median income increases. There needs to be a different level of attack here, not just significantly reducing the cost price of these particular goods, because essentially agriculture is a commercial activity, and therefore if it isn't profiteering, you're going to end up not being able to sustain the investment in the first place, and these people will be operating at a loss. So there needs to be some form of a concession. But not only that, they tell us that FDIs and GDPs are so much better on paper, and that and they do nothing to be able to create a. They do nothing to be able to create a wholesome, a better form of access to the people. Yeah, but the thing is, if all these forms of performances, especially in export markets, allow for foreign investors to be able to tap into existing networks, fuel in revenue, and essentially assuming there is an ample trickle-down effect, be able to funnel things into existing or burgeoning forms of infrastructure, assuming the trickle-down effect is not negated by corruption, etc., and things that the agricultural industry does not have the liberty to be able to negate. You will then be able to have connections with other countries using exports to be able to exact concessions. Now, first of all, there also is the thing that, well, economies of scale equals cheaper, therefore access. Now, I've told you there are things like income barriers that are a problem, but not only that, they say that export crops have a tendency to fluctuate because you're always at liberty at external market prices. But let me tell you one thing. The prices usually tend to fluctuate within a country at much higher rates as opposed to international bodies when that happens. Why? Is because there's always going to be there's always going to be foreign traders that will want to be able to opt in and purchase these goods because there are existing networks in which you can tap into it. There are things like the WTO that will obviously want to create things like free trade agreements to be able to ensure that exports remain sustainable. But not only that, that current model can never apply with, well, if you take that and shove it into the current, free trade, into things like food security, the fact is, well, because we've told you earlier in advance, the fact is, number one, a lot of these goods fluctuate depending on demand and dependency throughout the entire year. But not only that, there is an inherent sense of stockpiling that could occur.
If your problem is stockpiling, right, we can make that illegal. Are you then now still against our policy in order to aid people then? All those problems that you talk about, it can still be negated.
No, because stockpiling also falls under the under the legal scope of actual of trading. And yes, if you're a trader, you can legitimately actually stockpile it. It's called retailing. All right, but let me get into my substantives. Then they tell us that there's a heavily reliance and overdependence, and ceiling prices are not working. Well, hello, we've given you a ceiling price to be able to work towards so that you can have a consistent level of profit, and we subsidize your industry, and yet you are not able to perform. It is much better to be able to invest in existing infrastructure that will contain significant revenue to be able to perhaps be able to correct the problems that are occurring. But number one, I'm going to run this debate under two paradigms. One where there is a complete dire shortage, and one where there is a significant risk, but there is still ample supply. Firstly, this is the best possible answer to happen when you're running out of food because of the stopgap measures, because you will always consistently have enough revenue to be able to fill up the void. But not only that, governments take the proactive measure to be able to assess where the deficiency lies. That is the best possible thing to do. But not only that, we've told you that even with regards to R&D, we can always insist on building on infrastructure. The problem with R&D when it comes to perishable items with the scope of food security is the fact that you need to be able to, number one, funnel lots of money, and number two, be able to initiate it and then make sure it continues over a long period of time to be able to get results. The results are never immediate, but food security and food shortages have an immediate impact on society. Problem solution mismatch. But not only that, there is a heavy the dependence on international stock prices is a terrible thing. But guess what? We also have international leverage by exporting these particular crops. Therefore, you are able to use your existing infrastructural export infrastructure to tap into concessions. You can offer things like you can offer things for like free trade agreements. But not only that, once you insert yourself into the international agricultural sphere, people are more likely to take you seriously because you're a better exporter. But not only that, they're willing to share trade secrets on how you can best improve food security in your country if you're a viable competitor. None of that's going to happen if you are still dandying about on food security and not focusing on exports, which should give you the revenue to give all this particular leverage. And this is why we are proud to oppose.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome the member of government.
Yeah.
A few rebuttals before I move on to the substantive from our side, right? Firstly, on the issue of distribution. Mr. Speaker, the opposition side was solely harping on India. But we think, Mr. Speaker, that India is the only country that has a problem with distribution in which people have shortage of food, Mr. Speaker. We think it's not fair that they put that example solely, Mr. Speaker. And the second issue on insidious middleman, right? We think that on all scenarios, this middleman will always exist, but it's better under our paradigm where you have, because under our paradigm, Speaker, we believe that you have more food supply, so the middleman effect will not be as drastic or as damaging as what they propose, Speaker. So we think that our paradigm settles this better. On the second argument, right, on how the export will generate more revenue, we don't think that's necessarily true because the export crops that they are talking about are not consistently, the prices for these crops like palm oil, like palm oil, rubber are consistently dropping, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you later on that within my speech. Now, so they moved on from that and saying that the money generated by this revenue will be put into R&D and thus solve food security. Now, theoretically, this sounds great, right? But which countries are you talking about exactly? Mr. Speaker, it will only work in countries that are already economically established, countries like US, like China, like Russia, and these US, China, and Brazil. And these countries are the exact countries that already have their food supply. They are already established in terms of their growth in corn, in wheat, Mr. Speaker. So they can actually, so they are able to conduct R&D. But in countries like third world countries or developing countries like Malaysia, which like Malaysia or Indonesia, we can't depend on R&D, in this particular case. Denied. And lastly, because they say they want to boost their economy from this money, right? This increases investors to boost their agriculture. Now, wait a minute, right? You want to use the money you get to grow more food on the land that probably no longer exists because you were using that land to make that money in the first place. Mr. Speaker, we think that there's a scarcity of arable land that exists right now. And if you use this land on planting export crops, Mr. Speaker, we think that this land will no longer be viable in producing edible food later on. So, Mr. Speaker, what's the point of having money to invest in agriculture when you no longer have the land to conduct agriculture in, Mr. Speaker? Denied. Lastly, right, they were talking on, the second speaker was talking on consistent revenue. And we tell you, I told you just now, how consistent revenue is not accurate. And I'll explain that later in my argument, right? And he talked to you on international leverage for export crops, right, Speaker? We think that, let's look at the export crops they're talking about and who actually controls this international leverage that they're talking about. We think that it's being controlled by countries like US, countries like India and China, and they are the ones who actually control the market, the price market of these crops. So we think that in other countries, you're not benefiting anything.
And the fact that you have invested so much in export crops leaves you at a disadvantage when any crisis occur, when economical crisis occur, and you no longer have your own supply of food, right? So, Binay, I'm going to move on to my substantive now. Mr. Speaker, we think that opening has set up a good case, right? They told you on how we want to help the poor because subsidies are insufficient. They told you on how we were going to shift funding from export crops to edible crops, and they told you on how we're totally dependent on import crops. Good enough. But we're extending this debate to the real issue, right? Firstly, let's analyze the reality of the market for export crops right now. Mr. Speaker, what are the export crops we're talking about? We're talking about palm oil, we're talking about rubber, and we see from the statistics shows, Mr. Speaker, that from 2002 to 2012, there's been a drastic drop in, let's say, in palm oil. We see that the percentage of export within the country has dropped from 21 to 21%. For rubber, it's dropped to 34%, Speaker. So we think that it's no longer, the prices are no longer benefiting you. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, you look at export crops, we think that the market for that is volatile. Why? Because these crops, this rubber, this oil is being replaced by technology, right, Mr. Speaker? You no longer use tobacco in cigarette, right? We're moving towards electronic cigarettes. You no longer use rubber because you're using synthetic products now. So we think that the amount of investment you've made on these crops will not guarantee you a stable market. And look at the plantations. And look at who control. And Mr. Speaker, we see that the ones who are controlling this plantations within the country, like let's say for Indonesia, it's mainly controlled by private sectors rather than the government itself. You see that the tobacco plants within Indonesia are mainly controlled by private companies and not the government itself. So the direct benefit, the direct profit goes to that company that is an international company, which does not help your country itself, Mr. Speaker. We think that when you look at edible crops, right, they're mainly controlled by the government and people within your own country, Mr. Speaker, your own civilians. So we think that the profit that you make directly goes to the people. And our proposal helps the people better, right? Now, lastly, let's look at how when countries depend solely on trade for food supply, right? We think that trade is not a predictable avenue. Why? Because it depends on international relationships between your country and another country. It depends on the stability of the state of that country itself. We think that in today's society, sanctions are consistently done. Now, what if your country is being sanctioned, like Russia, like what happened to Russia, right? We think that Russia is now having a problem because they no longer have. Yes?
You see, when you are making the transition, wouldn't foreign companies would just flood the market with their to ensure the smaller companies in your country die off first?
What, Mr. Speaker? I don't understand how that relates at all to what I'm saying right now. Let's go back to my argument, right? We're telling you on how sanctions are always being implemented, right? And whenever at least when you're prioritizing food supply or edible crops, right? When an economical crisis happens, your country has your own supply. Because let's look at it this way: the country you're trading with will always want to prioritize their own civilians. Would they still continue trading with another country when an economical crisis? All countries are affected, right? And you have to keep your supply within your country to help your people. So we think that you should protect your own people. On second extension, right? In the event of scarcity of arable land, what should we use it for? We need to prioritize sustainability and growth, sustainability rather than growth, right? Because we think that when you use your land for these export crops that you're talking about, they're no longer viable for producing other crops. So that's why we think that our proposal serves the country, serves the people better. Back to propose.
Madam Chair, as a man who consumes the most food in this room, I'll be the first person to tell, guys, there's too much on our plate. But let's look at the burden coming from side closing opposition here. Is that Malaysia or these developing countries stands to benefit more from export, or at least when there's a creation of balance between security and trade. Let's look what has happened in this debate so far. Opening opposition are complaining that the poor can't buy food because it's too expensive. Sounds like me on Saturdays. But let's look. We've already proposed things like ceiling prices to control prices within the country. They can already work for that. Firstly, they want to remove the subsidies for ceiling prices in order to fund other agricultural industries in the first place. We think it is counterintuitive and you should keep those kind of subsidies for that. Firstly, we think those kind of subsidies are good enough. But later on, I'll explain some more why exactly we should continue the subsidies in terms of for staple food instead. Opening opposition wanted to talk about more revenue to buy food. We agree with that, and I wish that was my Saturday. But let's look at closing government here. There's several things I want to talk about. Is that firstly, the price drops for things that are non-staple food or products that we can actually eat. We can actually turn into our food. But the first thing we can say that if we continuously somehow support our agriculture industry in terms of tobacco or things they're already strong on, we can always continue the economies of scale. That means you can always produce more in order to gain more revenue. So the idea that the price would fall, well, those kind of things can be factored into when it comes to refineries or production, etc. Those kind of things happens every year. That's how the stock market works. Second of all, they complain about the idea of how these companies are mainly controlled by the private sector. Firstly, you still got to tax them anyway. Indonesia gains a huge revenue when it comes to Rokok Sempurna. I think that's great. But actually, Rokok Sempurna is owned by a bunch of American guys, Philip Morris. And thirdly, they said that going for trade supply and dependency on another country is bad. We think it's not exactly so. When you have like another country that's also dependent on you because you export products like rubber, and at the same time you are dependent on a country that has rice, that means you don't compete amongst each other. So when this country needs rubber from your side, they are more likely to actually invest in your company and make sure you have food security in the first place. That is what happens in Europe right now, when they decide to bail out countries or invest in other countries because you have the specialization within the Marshall Plan. Here's what closing opposition going to talk about. Before that, sanctions. But the simple thing about sanctions is that you are less likely to have sanctions when you have trade dependency against each other, because you are less likely to have conflicts between each other. That is the reason why we have euro in the first place. Closing opposition will talk about why regional dependency that opening government feels so much about is actually a good thing. But before that, yes.
During the economic crisis, you don't really need rubber, but you always will need food. Why would you have a trade with a country when you don't really need that product in the first place?
Well, firstly, like I said, the countries that are dependent on you in the first place would make sure you have food in your tummy so that you can work. Simple as that. Let's look. Firstly, creation of trade dependency within the region, or just to make the argument simpler, ASEAN, because we live in it anyway. But firstly, nature of food security in Malaysia. Firstly, is that we have a minimum threshold on what we need. We don't need to have a huge reserve. We just need what we have right now, and we already have cheaper import rates from countries that we're dependent on. Thailand is more willing us to give lower prices in comparison to other countries because we are willing to give them lower prices in terms of rubber. That means food security would always be there. Yeah. Second of all, we are not in the staple food industry, guys. We have to understand that it is mainly controlled by other nations who have a grip on the market, because logically, and you directly ignore the POI democracy, is that what happens when you have access? And when you have access, the most logical thing to do is for you to sell it, and you can't gain a lot of revenue to it because it's perishable in the first place. So you can't do all this great stockpiling for 6 months you want to talk about earlier on. So in contrast, when we export rubber, when we export palm oil, at least we are able to control that market in general. But here's secondly, why is it necessary to keep these distinct markets? Because we don't want to fragmentize the market even more and divide the competition even worse. When we compete with other companies, that will lead to smaller markets. It is harder for us to get out there and when we have to go through the transition. And that is where my POI came in, and we thought it was really important that she brushed off easily. Is that when you want to make that transition to an agriculture industry that is not export based, but to a much more to a much more staple food based at the end of the day, countries like Thailand would see this as a huge threat towards the industry. And while you are making that transition, which is probably taking like 15 to 20 years time, that's a huge period you have to go through. Our palm oil industry had to go through a huge period for the 80s, 90s to even actually work. So now when you reverse that, these companies would flood the market and they would make sure your companies die out in the first place, destroying whatever standards of living you want to have in the first place. That is why Malaysia has never decided to take up this proposal, but continuously to buy some W instead and become a powerhouse within the region and somehow control the market. So this transition is bad. But at the end of the day, why is this actually very beneficial? Very beneficial because firstly, you create economic specialization. Thailand will never intervene in the markets of Malaysia. Malaysia will never intervene in the markets of Thailand. So everybody has an interest of each other's country's stability. If I'm dependent on another country for rice and the other country is dependent on me for rubber, I have more of an interest to take care of that country's economy and figure out what is actually going wrong inside there. So you allow these people to actually create more investments within the country, and somehow that is why we want to bail each other out if something actually happens at the end of the day, making the country even more powerful in the region. It's how you create the ASEAN region into a major economic player in comparison to this. And lastly, that is where sanction comes in. Sanction won't come in because you are less likely to go to war to the nation or somehow have any form of conflicts with the other because you are dependent towards each other. But here's the last part: how exports guarantee revenue to reduce price for staple food. When you have exports, you have quotas to meet. That means Thailand, because they want to produce something, they need a certain amount of rubber to actually to do so. So when there is quota, there is an incentive to meet up with it, guaranteeing there is a constant flow of revenue for farmers. That means there will always be a market to places to sell your cotton, and there is a constant grip on the market. What happens when you have a constant grip of market? You have the power to produce more, firstly, and somehow you are able to meet the demand and somehow sell this kind of products. So that means constantly these farmers would actually have revenue, and somehow you increase the living standards of everyone. And unlike them, let's concede somehow domestic markets, you can get a lot of revenue. Those kind of things will only somehow stay within the country, and only farmers will get the better brand of it. But when you have exports, everyone at every level, not to mention you can increase the quota if you want to, you're able to get through the middleman who gets more money of it. The exporters get money of it. Everyone gets a higher living income. That is why Malaysia practically control the market when it comes to palm oil and rubber. And we should continuously control that in comparison to that. Because with that extra revenue means better wages, better standards of living, more food for me on Saturdays. Thank you.
The Chinese in me is very happy because we're debating the ancestral profession of agriculture, right? This is how I'm going to do my big speech, right? I'm going to divide it into three issues. Number one, on the whole idea of economical growth. Number two, on the role of government. These two issues are pertaining to the opening opposition. And thirdly, on the idea of dependency, something that side closing opposition want to talk about, right? Let's go to dependency first. Because number one, they say that, two levels under this, right? They say that the whole idea of dependency is basically this form of leverage, right? Where people need your rubber and you need their rice. But there is something flawed in this, because let's ask ourselves in this question. The motion clearly states that food security, right? And when exactly is food security important? Something that both sides miss out. It's in times of economic crisis, right? When we recognize that trades of things such as rubbers and tobacco will obviously be cut down simply because they are not essentials, right? You don't need to smoke to survive, but you need rice to survive as a Chinese itself. You have to recognize that this is very important and not as trivial as you think. Because in these instances, they will no longer be a leverage. It's not done yet. It's not leverage to you because now that your product, that your export is no longer seen of relevance in that.
essential time itself. We have to understand the sensitivity of your crop itself during a certain period of time. We believe that food security is more important during this time of crisis, because then you need this form of, you have to understand that trades will be reduced because every country will be trying to prioritize the money into more important sectors and trying to inject stimulus into the country and not into food. So you need this form of ample supply of food in your own country itself so that you can rely less on trade, right? Something they don't want to talk about. But number two, on how you, well, there's less risk of sanctions because now we are all happy and kumbaya, right? You have to understand this, right? When you talk about this dependency, it's also a very harmful threat against you, because now it can be used as a bargaining chip against you itself. Now other countries can threaten you to say, if you don't sell us rubber, we'll cut off your food supply. Why are you allowing this to happen when you can simply plant more of this food supply in your own country itself, right? Your idea simply opens up another opportunity for monopoly to happen, something that Dalia has already talked to you about, right? We've literally painted to you that the leading agricultural sectors in the world itself are 3 countries, right? India, China, and also US. These are simply very big countries and can really screw you up if they decide to cut off your staple food supply, right? You have to understand this. There's already a monopoly, and what is the best way for the government to actually prevent that from harming your citizens at the end of the day? But secondly, this very bizarre idea came in from Terence, is the idea of competition, on how you now fragmentize the whole idea and you allow competition to happen, therefore people hate you more. Hello, we never wanted to sell our food crops. The food crops are planted in our own country to support our own people. Never have we considered if they were going to venture into exporting the food crops, right? Terence, so you cannot just simply say that we are competing against Thailand. We are not. We are simply feeding our own people in case Thailand decides to screw us over, right? This whole idea of regional stability doesn't happen because now we are all happy and we can all focus on our real economy, something that Dalia has tried to talk to you about. Let's move on to the second one, right? I'll sit down, Terence. The idea of economical growth. Because you have to understand the reality of the market of agricultural crops, right? 2 things on this: price and control. Which country controls it, right? Because when you talk about price, we have seen that we already given you statistics, right? I'm going to give you more. The idea is this: the agricultural growth is simply not as lucrative and not as fat a cash cow as Kish wanted to paint to you about, right? Because we have already shown to you that in 1978, the total agricultural growth agricultural sector in the world itself is 21% compared to the 10% that's happening now. This simply shows you that agriculture is no longer a very viable economy in this sense, right? There is already a reduction in the idea because most countries are planting their own food, right? Why are we not making the shift? But you understand this: the price is dropping because there are always new avenues for you to actually replace this form of crops, right? When we are talking about rubber, there's always synthetic rubber, right? Something that I as a chemist would know. And we are talking about freaking palm oil. There's so many oil out there that you don't really need to rely on palm oil. That's why palm oil in Malaysia we're in big shit, because now people don't really want a palm oil anymore. And you have to understand this. The control is this, that most of the countries who are controlling this are countries that have already delivered to you. Countries like India, countries like China, who can actually already monopoly, right? So it's very unfair for you to say that you want to focus on these things when there is already a more demand for bigger markets out there. But secondly, on this source of income, right? If you listen carefully to Kish's speech, his source of income that he's talking to you about buying food is petroleum, right? So this shows to you that there are actually other viable sources of income for your country. That's not agriculture. For example, in Malaysia itself, it's petroleum. In other countries, it's other stuff, not agricultural crops, right? In reality, there is no sole country that has agriculture as their top exports. So we have no idea how this economy will simply collapse if you take out the agricultural aspect of it, right? You have to understand this. Agriculture is simply not viable in the 21st century. Let's talk about the role of government itself. Which should we prioritize, right? Security or growth, right? Because understand this. This form of economical growth, as I already painted to you, is easily replaced by other sectors. You can venture into the tourism sector, one of the examples. You can venture into the oil sector, right? Something that's very lucrative now. We don't see why, considering that there is already a scarcity of land, something that Dalia tried to talk to you about, why you should waste it on this form of wasteful agriculture, right? Because understand this, more often than not, than palm oil, the nature of these crops are this. When palm oil and rubber is planted in your land, more often than not, after you harvest it at the end of its lifespan, it simply cannot be used anymore, right? Compared to when you're actually planting edible crops and actually staple food, they can be producing 2 or 3 times a year, because this is what we call biannual plants, right? Something you have to consider is that simply the fertility of the land is something that you have to take into matter, especially when countries such as Malaysia are expanding more into building more houses and cutting off arable land. What should you best do with this arable land? Something that site government provided to you an idea about, to use it to actually sustain your own people and rely less on trade, when simply trade is no longer the main relevance of agriculture when you have other sectors to tap into. Before that, I'll take openings.
The yield is always going to be a problem, considering the fact that a lot of these biannual plants are susceptible to things like pesticides, and the fact that they will obviously be subject to fluctuating market prices. It's obviously inconsistent.
you cannot argue with me pesticides, especially when you're talking about plants in general, because this form of plants that you're talking about are susceptible to all these pesticides and pests that you're talking about anyways, right? But this fluctuating demand is something that you have to recognize. Fluctuating demand happens now when you have no supply to meet it. Under our paradigm, you have more supply, and therefore there won't be fluctuating demand because there will always be a constant supply, and there won't be a price fluctuation that you want to talk about, right? Because under our price, we no longer need subsidies to actually aid food stealing, right? We prevent this form of food stealing, and we don't use the taxpayers' money to actually subsidize it when we have our own supply and we have an ample supply of food for you to actually bring down the price as a whole, something that side opposition don't understand. What did side closing government did today, right? Very important stuff. We have already proven to you the reality and crystallization of today's debate, right? Especially in contextualized, right? We have already proven to you that number one, this market argument that both side oppositions want to talk about is not as lucrative as you say. It cannot be this cash cow that you want to tap into because simply there are other better ways for you to earn income, right? But secondly, we talk about how there is already a scarcity of arable land and the role of the government is to prioritize this, right? We believe that at the end of the day, this trade-off in a certain part of your income is more worth it when you can sustain your population at the end of the day. But thirdly, we believe that the government should always prioritize, and when we prioritize to this, you should always follow the farmer, you should always follow the Chinese saying and plant more rice in your own backyard. With that, go with side closing government.
As food security in countries such as even Malaysia grows, the country then seems to lose out in what you can do because you only limit the trade capabilities of that certain country in itself. Side of closing opposition seeks to prove you this, Madam Chair, that you stem more benefits in export, or to the very least, side of closing opposition strikes a balance in this debate. Within that side, government within this debate as a whole only tried to prove this, that how food crops will lead to a more stable market. Not necessarily showing us how once you reach that comfortable level of food, which was why my PR is very important, how do you then solve the other problems that now stem within status quo? What is the balance that side of closing opposition tries to strike into this debate? Firstly, it's this, that cash crops will be a better choice for a more stable economy once you reach the threshold of having a comfortable level of food security. But the second thing that we wanted to prove was this, how it allows countries to foster trade relationships. And the third thing was what came from my extension, was how you also shorten the economic gap of countries who may now flood the market and drown out other countries in itself. But the first thing that we have to talk about is this, in rebuttals. What's the difference between a sustenance of a cash crop and which we can bring in comparison to a food crop? What's the model that we saw from side of government in today's debate? That firstly, the problem that you seek to solve is food security first, therefore then economy. But only once you reach this level of comfortable food level, that's when you decide to enter the economy by somehow selling all the crops that you have right now. What that means is this, Madam Chair, that firstly, you only choose to sell what your main crop now seems to be, which is food crops, because you only grow that for food security. What do we have to say to this instead of closing opposition? First thing is this, that the kind of revenue that you garner is one where it's still minimal to the very point, because you might be a country that solely prioritizes food security as a problem compared to the rest, where you can't really sell your other crops. Madam Chair, I think that's a problem. But the second idea that you create is this, that your own idea, that food security is only a problem that only your country has right now. We think that you're losing a chance to capitalize on the economy that exists within status quo. That other people tend to capitalize on your economy rather than you have to, when you necessarily have to go through that transition period from changing food farms to cash crops right there. That's why Terence told you that it takes probably 10 to 15 years for you to have that transition period just because you only grow food crops for food security there. But the third thing that we have to tell you is this, if most countries only prioritize food crops, that means that no one has an interest in you economically. But why? That's why it's important for us to say that prioritizing only food security means this, that prioritizing cash crops means this, that you also create this level of expertise with the regional board for better trade. But why, Madam Chair? That's what incentivizes countries to bail out your own other countries that have trade with you, in comparison to the agricultural system of countries that only want to plant food. But why? Because we don't think that Thailand will necessarily have an interest to help Malaysia out when you only grow rice and because Thailand probably has enough of rice. So that means that there's no level of investment there. But also it means this, that you only encourage countries to grow food crops. Because when Thailand only grows food crops and Malaysia only grows food crops, that means that we probably won't have a level of trade there. So we think that countries like Malaysia can even will not necessarily have a stable level of economy when you only want to grow food crops at the end of the day. Before that, I'll take closing.
Number one, we don't need to rely on Thailand anymore because we have our own rice and the only profit to us is rice. But number two, even if you want to talk about excess food, not the debate, any money is still some form of money, right? What's the problem?
Look, that's a concession showing us that once you have enough food, a comfortable level of food security, that you no longer probably want to garner any more trade with any other countries. But the only thing that you can do now is to only have the certain level of expertise within cash crops in itself, which is what came from extension. So let's move on to the extension that came from side of closing opposition there. The first important thing is this, how you foster a regional trade dependency and why it's important in this debate. We think that the balance that side of closing opposition tried to make in this debate is one where we have to recognize that trade is a long-term basis of diplomatic cooperation between countries as a whole in essence. But also why it has many tangible benefits, Madam Chair. The first thing is this, when you open the capacity to foster trade, you create a certain trading partnership with other countries. That allows for a firm basis of cash flow towards that certain country from cash crops. Because the demand for cash crops is one which is always high, Madam Chair. And even then, an added level of analysis is that there's always cash crops which is always sought over after another country when it comes to being an economic staple of a certain country. That's why countries such as Malaysia, even if you grow a lot of rice, you can't necessarily export it to other countries such as Thailand because they probably have enough that they probably need, right? That's why another level of that is that's exactly why Malaysia grows rubber and quite all, to recognize that it allows us to trade on an economical level. But the second thing that came from us is this, that it allows countries to retain your image on the market necessarily. Because it's also a game of what you have to be in a key player of economic markets right now. Countries lose out on your chance to expand in the market of expertise when you only grow food crops within status quo. That means the slower you prioritize cash crops, the less opportunity you get to break out in the market necessarily when you don't have the level of penetration to get into the market when you only grow food crops. So the cost-benefit analysis within this debate is when we see a country that has a gap that widens even more between a country which is probably a third world country, which only prioritizes food security, rather than a country that probably has cash crops. Therefore, you gain that level of economical benefit. That means that the gap widens even more. That means you won't necessarily lose out on a more cost level benefit analysis. We don't think that should deny these countries the level of capital that you can get when you lose out really necessarily. We don't want to take that step, and we always err on the side of caution. But the third thing that we say is this, that it creates a better linked trade community, and that came from Terrence's extension of how it trades a regional trade box such as the assets. But even so, Madam Chair, what we have to consider as a benefit is this, that to gear up to become a better trading country, these countries have to go through a number of key changes, not just growing more food, but just ensuring that you have a comfortable level of food security. As well as you develop the economy, Madam Chair, you build the trade infrastructure that exists within a side closing opposition, not the R&D that they necessarily wanted to talk about. For example, increased trade will always focus more attention to good governance. The benefits of a more stable flow of money is one where we always prioritize more than food security, which can really bring you more benefits at the end of the day. Although it comes about as a facilitator of trade, Madam Chair, we think that in the worst case scenario on the side of closing opposition, you still see structural changes which have a better trickle-down effect for underdeveloped countries. That's why it's very much important for you not to lose out early in this level of what capital you can gain from other cash crops that you can grow right now. That's the exclusive benefit that only came aside from closing opposition. If it's any side that understands the debate of economy better than any other side in this debate, it's always closing opposition. Thank you.